Yes, thank you, Isham, and thank you, Sharq Diwan, for having me. I'm very honored to take part in this series. Uh, I'm an historian, and I suppose when people ask me something that happened 2 months ago is a pivotal moment in history, I'm a bit skeptical because I don't know if it's a pivotal moment in history unless 10 or 20 years uh, ahead of that moment have already passed. But I understand what you mean. I'm just trying to say that it definitely has the potential of becoming a pivotal moment. And time will tell whether it is. But before even discussing it as a pivotal moment, it was a very inspirational moment. There's no doubt about it. I was fortunate enough to be on the ground in Haifa when the young Palestinian were defending the businesses, their homes, expressing very courageously their solidarity with the Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem, in the Gaza Strip. And it was a moment of unity where it didn't matter whether people belong to that party or the other. And it was a very clear vision for the future of one Palestine, one liberated Palestine, without all the kind of juggling that the more mature, if you want, political elite of the Palestinians has been trying to operate since the 1990s, between a wish to be accepted by the West and the United States on the one hand, and on the other hand, to remain loyal to the Palestinian national vision. This was pure, this was without any such tactics and exercises, impossible exercises of trying to kind of correlate giving in to the idea of a two-state solution or an American peace on the one hand and remain part of the liberation process on the other. This was pure demonstration of the Palestinians' struggle for human rights, for civil rights, which are part of their national rights. And it was echoed by similar expressions of resistance and solidarity elsewhere in Palestine, historical Palestine, in the Palestinian diaspora, and as you rightly say, Isham, also around the world. So it was also inspiring in the sense that the level of support that this kind of display of a wish for liberation, for human rights, for civil rights, was echoed and supported by so many people around the world in much larger numbers than ever before, and by groups and individuals who until now were not identified as known friends of Palestine. And this all has the potential to make it a pivotal moment, but one has to see whether this energy would be maintained, it would erupt again in a different way. We have been there before in the Arab Spring, as you know, and we are a bit cautious before we kind of call something a third uprising and so on. But by the way, I'm quite sure that the third uprising will happen, and not too late, not in the near future, but time will tell if this is really the prelude or was it one event.
Thank you so much, Professor Pappe, for a very thought-provoking answer, and I think for many a very sobering one. And I think you've said in recent times in your reflections, I'm thinking in particular of your discussion with Ramzi Baroud about 2 weeks ago. I think you said something about the need to remember that not a single inch of the ground has been liberated yet. We should not get carried away with while being optimistic and while understanding the significance of the moment. And I think this sort of cautious optimism, maybe that characterizes your position, I perhaps would be nice to hear you talk more about what you mean when you say, for example, that that this can develop into something bigger. Do you mean by this that there are clear steps that are missing at the moment, or what do you exactly like? How do you conceive of the next step that could take this to a mass revolt or the third uprising and so on?
Yes, I think there are a few factors that we should consider. One is that from the very beginning, the Zionist project, even before the creation of the State of Israel, was based on two pillars, a material pillar of military strength, economic strength, and so on, and a moral pillar, where being legitimized, despite the fact that it was a colonialist project, being legitimized at least by the West as a just solution for the Jewish problem in the West. And the State of Israel continued to build its strengths on the basis of these two pillars. What we have seen ever since the first Intifada in 1987 is the erosion of the moral pillar. In fact, the events in May this year almost kind of, cut to the core of the pillar, so to speak. Not much has been left. Not much is left on the moral pillar anymore, especially after the last attack on Gaza. But this was incremental. This happened through the years. So one thing that can happen in a very near future, that finally we will see the vast support that the Palestinians have in the civil society, not only in the West and not only in the United States, but also all over the world. We might see the beginning of it being translated to policies from above, which we haven't seen much yet. This is something to watch, whether the very important work done by solidarity movements with Palestine around the world is beginning to bear fruit in the way it influences policies from above by governments. This was the moment of success for the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, when they moved from boycotts, which is something that the civil society is doing, to sanctions, which is something that the state is doing. So this is one way. And I think really solidarity movements around the world are doing all they can, and one can just ask them to do much more of the same. One shouldn't, this is not criticism of what they're doing. They're really good people working hard day and night for Palestine and on behalf of Palestine. The second thing to watch is, of course, the main malaise of the Palestinian political movement, which is fragmentation, disunity, infighting, which the younger generation dislikes and shows again and again that it doesn't accept. Will they be able to translate this disdain for fragmentation, for disunity, into a new kind of unity, organized one, structured one? Will they move either the PLO into a new orientation, or will they create a new organization for the movement of liberation? Will they able to cast into that movement the content that they're already articulating? A clear vision of one Palestine, liberated, decolonized, that influences the Arab world as a whole, with a vision for better life for people in it, and the end of Zionism and colonialism in it. The discourse is there, the content, if you want, is there, but there is no match yet between a strong infrastructure or even structure to carry it, to make it a transformative force, which is what you want to see on the ground. And the last thing, and this will happen as well, I think, is the realization of the Jewish society in Israel that Zionism in many ways is coming to an end, not necessarily because they would share mine or yours moral criticism of Zionism, but because it doesn't work anymore. Sometimes you get a message through the feet and not through your head. This is not, this the kind of thing that I think only really people like me who live in Israel for many years and come from the Jewish society understand what does it mean to have, on the one hand, the strongest army in the Middle East, very successful high-tech nation, a member of the OECD on the one hand, and a very insecure society, people who live in constant fear and insecurity. It's a paradox. You would think that if you have the strongest army in the world and you have a high-tech nation, why should you feel insecure? It's the Palestinians who should feel insecure. I mean, they're the ones who are targeted all the time. But the Israelis feel much more insecure than the Palestinians do, as absurd as it does sound. And the question is, what will they, so far, the lesson from that, unfortunately, was that they need to be fiercer, more brutal. But maybe somewhere there in the horizon, they would listen to people like myself and say, there's another lesson to be learned from it. You need to take a very different way of looking at who you are, what have you done, what are you doing, or what you can be doing in the future. So I think in all these are three kind of areas to watch, to see whether the potential that is there is really maturing and is developing into a transformative force.
Fascinating. I think the third point that you mentioned, which is I think the closest to the theme of the session in terms of, we've called it the crisis of Zionism, and of course there's a presumption there in terms of, some would say this is premature to call it a crisis or the end of Zionism. But what I find interesting in is that you're saying it doesn't need to be a moral conviction that leads to the end of Zionism within, the detachment doesn't need to be on moral grounds. It just, from a pragmatic point of view, that's the key thing here. And I suppose my question is, do you see a difference on the moral front as well? Or do you foresee a change of view also on that moral dimension as well, in terms of being, the conviction that this is a morally just project? Is that something that you're seeing is changing now? Or do you see this as strictly going to be on the pragmatic front, this is not working, even if it's a just project?
Yeah. Well, most of the whites in apartheid South Africa did not give in to the fall of apartheid because they were convinced it was morally wrong. But nowadays, if you visit South Africa, almost every white person you meet will tell you, I was against apartheid. And you say, well, if you all were against apartheid, why was it maintained for so many years? I expect similar things to happen with Zionism for the Jews in Israel, but for the time being, and this is much more difficult than the white minority in South Africa. The Jews in Israel are not a minority, or at least not a small minority, and they have the support of the United States and Jewish communities around the world. I think that the vast majority are still indoctrinated in a racist, ethnic way that does not allow them to open up to moral discussions yet. I'm not giving up on this. I mean, I'm doing all I can, and others do as well, to try and persuade them and show them another way. But it's a huge mountain to climb. Where I do see more profound change in the moral dimension, as we called it, is among the young Jewish American community. Young Jews in America are beginning to see the moral dimension that you and I probably see in this whole question, and they might influence the young Jews in Israel as well. There are pockets in Israeli Jewish civil society of young people who are beginning to see the light and are acting upon this new understanding. One barometer, one litmus paper for this kind of change is the increase in the number of young Israeli Jews who refuse to go to the army. And as you know, it is you have to go to the army in Israel, and you pay very dearly if you refuse to go, and they're willing to pay the price in the name of their moral convictions. So I think that the way Israeli politics develops with a clear kind of right-wing agenda, settler colonialist agenda, an ethnic and racist agenda, I think it might also create a larger group of Israeli Jews inside who might be open to a discussion on decolonization, de-Zionization. It's not happening yet. I don't want you to get the wrong impression. It's not happening yet. And these things don't happen by themselves. You need to work on it. But I think what is more likely to happen as the first stage, has happened in South Africa, is what I call the pragmatic realization that you need to change a disc and look differently at the world.
Excellent. On that, I mean, if you were to paint us a picture of the sort of the domestic Israeli opinion, I mean, are you saying that, I mean, the way you presented it, it almost looks like we're heading towards a very severe polarization of Israeli society between a hardening sort of right wing that will just be, you know, even more committed to the Zionist project, and then a growing pole at the other end of people who are, you know, especially the young, you know, saying this is just not working, or it's not just, and it's just, you know, morally doesn't make sense and politically doesn't make sense? Or do you see something a little more complicated in terms of, you know, how do you see the balance of opinion within Israel currently and where it's heading? Is there you know, some clear picture that's emerging in your view?
Yeah, no, I think the more complicated version is the right one. There isn't yet a polarization. I wish there was, but there isn't yet. Most of the Israeli Jewish electorate of all ages is either voting for center parties or right-wing parties. What used to be the Zionist left, kind of an attempt to square the circle to be both an ethnic state and a democratic state, don't have much support for many years now. So there is no yet as polarization. So I think it's more complex, but I think that with the possibility of what we talked about at the beginning, of governments in the world adopting the positions of civil societies on Palestine, with a clearer Palestinian unity and vision for the future, I think that we will see more confusion. I'm warning that at first I think the reaction can be severe and brutal. By the way, the same happened with apartheid South Africa. The last days of apartheid South Africa were the bloodiest, the most brutal ones in the history of that regime. So we have to be ready for that, unfortunately. But I think in the long run, it creates possibilities. For the time being, by the way, young Israeli Jews who don't feel comfortable being part of Israel because of the moral dimension are leaving, which is both, I don't know if it's a pity or not, depends. Sometimes you would say, fine, less settlers in our homeland. Others would say we're losing people who could be comrades in the struggle. Berlin itself hosts today 40,000 young Israeli Jews who feel that they don't want to be part of Israel. So we need to watch it. I would say that the main effort is really pressure from the outside, unity of the Palestinians. It would be a bonus if it will be accompanied by a dramatic change in Israeli perceptions and mentality, but it's not a condition. The change in Israel is not a condition for liberating Palestine. It will make it easier, it will make it more successful, more peaceful, but it's not a condition by no means.
That's really fascinating, especially the point you made about South Africa, and it actually reminds me of the situation in another case that tends to often be invoked in relation to Israel Palestine, which is Algeria, and the rise of violence and how the period between the ceasefire in the last few months of the war and independence was arguably one of the bloodiest periods in the history. So it's quite interesting that this seems to be the pattern in other countries. There is something I'd like to quote you, something you said recently in a discussion, which I'd like you to sort of elaborate on. You've described the current period, which I take to mean the current few months, or I mean, you may be able to clarify. You said we live in a dangerous historical juncture where international public opinion, Palestinian unity, anti-Zionist forces within Israel are speaking, the same language of resistance and, Palestinian agency. And, this is a very significant alliance. And yet, there is also a counter alliance that is, equally formidable. And I wanted to perhaps ask you to elaborate on why you think this is a specifically dangerous juncture. Is it from a perspective of people who are, struggling for Palestinian liberation, that they need to, be wary of it and be mindful of what the juncture actually means?
Yes, I think I was mainly thinking that the counter alliance to the alliance that wants to perpetuate the reality in Palestine as it is today is very powerful. It's made of multinational corporations, some Arab regimes, quite a lot of course, countries in the West, pro-Zionist lobbies elsewhere, the United States. India is supporting Israel now quite unconditionally because of probably the Kashmir problem. China is ambivalent but doesn't constitute any threat to Israel's policies. The African regimes, at least, are not willing to be, as they were willing in the 1970s, to be part of the open solidarity with the Palestinians. So this is a formidable coalition. The counter coalition doesn't yet have all the potential members who can be there. And I think that's what I was referring to. For two reasons. One is everybody thinks that the only key for ending injustice in Palestine lies in Washington. It all has to go through America. And that's wrong. That's wrong. One of the ways of strengthening the coalition for good is to put other societies, other parts of the world at the center of the intervention, whether it's the Muslim world, Southeast Asia, South America, South Africa. I mean, these are countries and societies that still accept a very marginal role in the international dimension of Palestine. They need to be far more central in order for that coalition to be formidable. So that's one point to think about. The other one is, and I think that's beginning now, there is a connection between the oppression of the Palestinians and the oppressions of the African Americans, of the native people in Canada, Australia, and in the United States itself, of workers in a neoliberal world. There's another layer of networking and solidarity that could enhance the issue of Palestine if it will be clear that it's also an issue of other oppressions in the world, that you're not only asked to show solidarity with Palestine, Palestine is showing solidarity with your struggle as well. And I'm always reminded of the incredible scene I saw in the Gaza Strip during the brutal American police attack on African Americans in Ferguson. The Palestinians under siege in the Gaza Strip demonstrated in solidarity with the African Americans in Ferguson, realizing that the American police is being trained by the Israelis, that they're using methods that they are familiar with for dispersing demonstrations and so on. So I think that kind of building of additional layer to the counter coalition should be there, because otherwise the other coalition is very powerful in its ability to continue the destruction of Palestine and the Palestinians.
Excellent. I'd like to just make a quick comment to people who are watching. If you have questions, I'd urge you to try and put them in. Do not leave them to the very end, because yesterday we had a large number of questions that we could not be put in because we had run out of time. So you feel free to ask us as soon as you have a question in mind. So on the question of the alliance, the solidarity, Professor Pappe, this idea that the Palestinian struggle has to be understood, or has to at least be envisaged in some way as part of other broader struggles. Is the strength of this alliance purely in terms of the moral strength that it confers on the Palestinian case, in terms of how people, the growing number of people who embrace it and talk about it, or do you see a lot something a bit more sort of operational in terms of what the alliance can bring to how do you see the mechanisms through which this alliance can actually change things, so to speak?
Yes, I think it can work in several ways. One is by kind of uniting and coordinating the effort and exposing the similarities and the connection. I just mentioned one of them, the fact that the securitization industry in Israel is very much connected to the powers that oppress minorities in Kashmir, in Brazil, or in the United States. So one thing is having a clearer view on the map of the networking of the counter coalition, of the coalition that perpetuates the issue of Palestine. Not enough exposure has been done there. And secondly, I think that of course advocacy and lobbying should not be just the tools of the other side. There is a kind of a purist idea that this is what Zionists do. But I think that now that there are few members of House of Representatives and members of Parliament in Britain and so on that are part of the coalition for change in Palestine, would mean that some of the methods of persuading mainstream politics, mainstream media, and so on to adopt a new language, a new approach, should be adapted as well and adopted as well and exercised alongside the more popular manifestation of solidarity, which are huge demonstrations and so on. And I think this already bore some fruits where it was attempted.
Fantastic. We've got a question which I'd like to pose. It's from I believe I'm saying the name right, Mina, and it's to do with the nature of Zionism. And if I may, just moderator's privilege to sort of reinterpret the question a bit, is to say what's the if there is a crisis of Zionism, and we're seeing, as you said, especially young Israeli Jews sort of drifting away from Zionism. Certainly, the political sort of hard version of Zionism. What does a different alternative sort of vision, a post-Zionist Jewish political project, what does it look like? What is it? How is it different from the standard traditional Zionist project or vision for Jews in Israel?
Yes. Well, I think the Zionist movement succeeded in kind of confusing everyone about Zionism and Judaism. And one of the problems, I think, of people who are easily intimidated if someone calls them an anti-Semite because they criticize the state of Israel or they criticize Zionism as an ideology. One of the problems when you're faced with such an allegation is that you cannot answer such a soundbite with another soundbite. You can't sort of say, oh no, I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm just against Zionism. And because everybody is confused about the difference between Zionism and Judaism, you don't get out of it very easily. Now, for some people, it doesn't matter, but in places like in the West, if you are accused of anti-Semitism, you will lose your job. So it's not a game. It's if you are, and the Israeli lobby is working very hard to weaponize anti-Semitism and to brand every critic of Israel as an anti-Semite, which, as I say, has these people pay a very high price if they are if that kind of allegation is being accepted. And look what happened to the leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, an extreme example maybe, but there are many other examples, and I'm sure when you talk with Norman tomorrow, Norman will tell you rightly that we know about the cases of lecturers in America who were ousted from their position because of criticism of Israel and because they were defined as anti-Semites, but we don't know of all those people who weren't even considered to the job because of their non-support of the Palestinian question. So what we need to do is to go back a little bit in history and understand that Judaism is a religion and Zionism is an ideology. Religion and ideology are not the same. And when Zionism appeared as an ideology in the late 19th century, it was fed by two ideas. One was kind of romantic nationalism, an ethnic racist kind of nationalism that a lot of people in Europe adopted, sometimes in a just struggle against big empires. But nonetheless, it was very purist. It said exactly who you are and more importantly, who you are not. And also by a more genuine fear of what would happen to the Jews in Europe that were still anti-Semitic, and they were right. The people who remained in many parts of Europe eventually experienced the Holocaust in 1939. So, but it was still an ideological solution for the problem of the Jews. Most of the Jews, by the way, did not choose that solution. Some Jews were very religious, and they said, "We trust in God to find the solution. We're not going to do much about it." Others believed in socialism, in an international revolution. Others went to other places where democracy was started to develop and believe in it. So we have to go back to the basic. You can be a lot of Jews even today are not Zionists, and a lot of Zionists are not Jews. Zionism began as a Christian project before it was a Jewish project. It was an evangelical Christian project that believed that if the Jews return to Palestine, it's part of a divine scheme that would bring back the Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, and the conversion of the Jews to Christianity. And this is still a very important group in America, the Christian fundamentalists or the Christian Zionists, as they are called. So I think there is a clear vision for what is, it's not a post-Zionist vision, it's an anti-Zionist vision where Judaism returns to be a faith, a religion, and as always was the case in Judaism before Zionism arrived, for some people, it's a more secular identity that belongs to their family heritage and maybe is not that meaningful in their life. For some, it's still a very important religious idea and they want to be pious and keep keep the imperatives of the religion as much as they can. But all in all, very much like Islam and Christianity, it's a dogma that defines the relationship between the faithful and God and between the faithful between themselves. These are not dogmas of colonization, oppression, and so on. This is maybe what some religious people are doing, but that's not what religion is about. And the same is true. So the vision would be for Jews who might decide to stay in a liberated Palestine, might decide to leave, will be able to live as religious Jew, as secular Jew, whatever they want, but they won't be able to continue the colonization, the oppression, and the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. That's the main way that you de-Zionize yourself and you become again a Jew, if you want. Israel is not a Jewish state. In my reading, a Jewish state doesn't do what Israel does. For me, a Jewish state is one that respects human rights and civil rights, and especially is aware of victimization because of its own history of victimization. I don't see anything of it in Israel from the very beginning until today.
Do you see this? I mean, I suppose that's the central sort of moral argument against Zionism, and in many ways, I detected, there is this. I mean, your position, is that something you see is being embraced more within Israel, and the fact that essentially there's this fundamental contradiction between the tenets of Judaism and Zionism, or is that something that just is not part of the conversation yet in any meaningful way?
Mm-hmm. It's complex. It's complex because take the ultra-Orthodox Jews. Religiously, they cannot be Zionists because for them Zionism is tampering with the will of God. And yet many of them support the Zionist state. A very small group, the Torah Carta, does not support them, but they have a tiny minority among the ultra-Orthodox Jews who are an important factor in the right-wing governments of Israel. So you can say they're anti-Zionist because they really believe that the secular Jewish state is a heresy. But on the other hand, they're also racist towards Arabs and Palestinians. It's different. You can see that, I will put it this way: the number of young Jews who understand what I'm talking about is growing by the day, but it's growing in a very slow pace. I suppose that would be the most accurate way of making sure that you're not over optimistic or pessimistic, depends on your perspective. Yeah.
Fantastic. Stepping back a little, this time last year, the talk was all about the fact that there's all these massive regional shifts, the normalization wave that came, and it was for many people on the sort of the Palestinian sort of activism and Palestinian liberation space, a pretty bleak time to see all these governments so swiftly embrace the normalization project. We're in a very different place today, I believe, and I would be quite interested to know whether you think, as some do, that what happened in this year, and especially with Trump out of the picture, at least for now, whether this is just a brief blip, or whether this is something that still is with us. It's a marked and shift that is here to stay. We've got a question from Walid in this regard, and asking whether this wave is going to have an impact that's essentially going to be lasting on what happens next, or do you think it's just essentially something that has just receded away into the background in the same way it came about?
Yeah, time will tell. It's very difficult. I'll give you two examples why I'm not sure it's over yet. One is today, the Emirates opened their embassy in Tel Aviv. The first embassy was opened with a lot of PR around it, with an ambassador from the Emirates who said a few words even in Hebrew to show how much he wants to kind of be okay with the local society. Actually, there's three things I want to say about that. There was one thing that happened today. What happened yesterday was that King Hussein of Jordan called the new president of Israel, Herzog, and they sort of vowed to open a new page in the relationship between the two countries, because there was a personal animosity between King Abdullah and Netanyahu. But that doesn't mean that actually they are going to try and strengthen the normalization between Jordan and Israel. And Biden, I don't expect for a moment that the Biden administration would be against this kind of so-called normalization. They would definitely not work to undo it, and they would work to push it forward, as would the government that replaced Netanyahu. So all the actors that built this normalization chapter are still in power. Nobody who's against it came to power. So I'm not that sanguine that this is over. What is, of course, under the surface but this was always the case, are the societies, the civil societies, whether it's in Bahrain, in Jordan, in Egypt, or wherever normalization is being attempted. They are totally against it. They don't allow any normalization to turn into a proper so-called peace agreement. But this is true since Anwar Sadat came to Jerusalem in 1977. There's nothing new there. Something new would be if you could show a movement of the civil society, as happened in the 70s, that forces, in a way, the Arab regimes not to partake in the next stage of normalization. I'm not seeing it yet, but these things erupt very quickly and very powerfully, and sometimes it's not easy to see them happening even a short moment before they do. So there's always hope there. Yes.
I'd like to move the discussion a little bit to the subject of history. I mean, you are, not just a historian by training, but somebody who has really had a huge and marked impact on how we understand the history of the region and the conflicts. And my question, I suppose, is, you spoke a lot about the fact that there is a lot to the Palestinian issue that is to do with rights, and there's a lot that can be used in that sense to build alliances with other struggles across the globe. But going back to the question of historical grievances and the fact that the role that history plays in this question, do you feel that essentially history is still the prime lens through which we should understand and deal with the issue of Palestine? Or is this something that we need to maybe step back from? Or how do you see the role of history in terms of people trying to understand how to engage with the issue?
Yes, I think the historical context is still very, very important. We cannot give it up. And there are two reasons for it. They're actually interconnected. Zionism is a settler colonial movement, and the state of Israel is a settler colonial state. And just to remind ourselves, settler colonialism is not like classical colonialism. These are not British or French people building a colony for their empire, and when the empire falls, can go back to their empire. Now, settlers are usually, definitely in the case of Zionism, but also in other cases, are people who were running away from their homelands and were seeking a new home and a new homeland. And therefore, the option of forcing them to return to their homeland was never a very practical one and hardly worked, apart from one case in Algeria, maybe because they were so close to France, and maybe it's a bit of a different case study than the others. Because the nature of settler colonialism is this idea of replacement and displacement. You want to replace the native people, displace them, and take their place. As long as you believe that this is the right thing to do, as long as you believe that this is the only way for your project to succeed, there's no reason to believe that you will stop until you succeed. Look what happened in North America. When did settler colonialism in North America stop? Only after the native people were genocided. Then it was stopped. So in Palestine, the Zionist movement is less interested in genocide, thank God, but they're interested in ethnic cleansing, which is as vile and a crime against humanity. But they have not succeeded in completing the ethnic cleansing that they perpetrated in 1948. So all the policies of Israel, the strategies of Israel, from 48 until today, are informed by this DNA of a settler colonial society and state. And you don't understand this DNA if you don't understand the history. You cannot see it on a kind of a continuum from beginning to end. You know, the late scholar of settler colonialism, Patrick Wolf, who died unfortunately, he said that settler colonialism is not an event, it's a structure. What he meant by that was that maybe the circumstances change over history, but the target is the same target. The vision of a de-Palestinized, de-Arabized historical Palestine is still there. The means may change, the methods may change according to circumstances and capacities, but not the drive, not the impulse. He called it the logic, I call it the impulse to move forward. This is why the Palestinians, when they look at the events from 1948 until today, call it in Arabic, al-Nakba al-Mustamirra, the ongoing Nakba, meaning that the catastrophe continues, whether the catastrophe is the expulsion of one family from an East Jerusalem neighborhood, or whether the catastrophe is the expulsion of million Palestinians from Palestine in 1948, it's the same catastrophe. The reasons for that catastrophe are the same, the perpetrators are the same, their ideology is the same, and the power to resist it may change, but it's the same power and it's the same forces of resistance that were there before. So I don't think we are living in the same historical chapter. That's why we cannot even call it proper history. We're still within that historical chapter. It is not ended yet. When it will have a closure, we can then maybe think about leaving it behind us. But while we're still in it, there's no way we can expunge the historical context.
This, I mean, the logic or the impulse, as you call it, what does it, I mean, is it sort of self-articulated? Is it self-knowing, or is it mostly the result of, you know, does it just like make things up as it goes along? By which I mean, a lot of the actions that we see now, you know, the West Bank is essentially has been rendered completely, you know, I mean, it's meaningless to speak of a two-state solution today. And I think even its most sort of ardent proponents have stopped even mentioning the term. You know, it's embarrassing. You know, is that, you know, what logic essentially understands this as a meaningful direction in which to go? Like, what's the end point here? You know, what's the logical? You know, is this just a, you know, forces essentially the momentum and the energy going in that direction, or is there a plan that we essentially cannot yet see that you think we should be, you know, aware of?
Well, it's both. It has to be nurtured. It has to be maintained through fear, manipulating people's fears, people's apprehensions, racism, and so on. So that you have an educational system, you have a cultural system, you have a media. So the people who are in charge are not letting inertia by itself work. I mean, they make sure. I'll give you one example why they need to nurture it. Although people are educated in such a way and are molded in such a way, so in a way, there's no danger that they would forget what is their role in this project. For instance, when there are deviations, the government reacts very forcefully. For example, when there was an attempt, the education system in Israel, apart from the universities, is segregated. There's a special section for Arab education, education for the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, and education for the Jews. And when there was an attempt to create Arab Jewish schools or even kindergartens, the government does all it can to put obstacles on the way of such a project. So it has to be on the guard. God forbid if you know, Jews and Arabs would feel that they have something in common and a common destiny. That doesn't serve the Zionist project. More important was what happened in the 50s when Jews came from the Arab countries and at first felt affinity not with the Jewish settlers who came from Europe, but with the Palestinians who were left in Israel after 1948. It made sense for them to feel culturally and socially much more comfort when living next to Palestinians and talking with Palestinians. And that again did not serve the project. So they were forcefully separated and distanced from Arab areas so that they won't feel affinity with the Palestinian community. And until today, there's a huge effort to de-Arabize these Arab Jews, to tell them you're not Arab. There's a whole scholarly edifice to convince them that they were a national group in Algeria or Morocco or Iraq, that they were not Jews, Moroccan Jews or Algerian Jews or Iraqi Jews, that they were a nation by itself, which is rubbish, nonsense. But it doesn't matter that they want to rewrite history so that these people would feel that they don't have anything in common with the Palestinians. So yes, it's inertia, but it's also nurtured and it's on the guard all the time. If there are any danger of it being challenged by common sense and by humanity, then the machinery is getting into action to make sure that these things don't happen.
If we look at the history of the Zionist project and we take, let's say, the last 100 years, at various junctures, especially in the early sort of decades, you could see that the sort of the next goal was very clear. You know, in the initial sort of first half of the century,
Yeah.
you know, as much migration as you can, then, you know, the establishment of the state, but then the consolidation of the territory, expansion of the territory. We're now in a situation where it's not foreseeable, as far as, you know, I can tell. And, you know, I think nobody's suggesting Israel is trying to expand into Egypt or Jordan or any other regional sort of, you know, beyond its current borders. So what's the project? I mean, it's like, what's, you know, its own internal sort of story about what it's trying to do. What is that?
Yeah. Well, the project is to keep the status quo at all costs. There is now a sense in the political and military elite of Israel that more or less what has been achieved so far is good and has to be maintained, but what is maintained has to be explained. Namely, we have total control, Israelis would say, over the West Bank, which is good, but that means we have to complete in a tactical way the division of the West Bank into a Jewish West Bank, which is Area C, 60% of the West Bank, and make sure that nothing dangerous is developing in areas A and B, which are 40% of the West Bank, namely that the PA would continue to be there, and we can subcontract to the PA our control of the area. And that's fine for the Israelis. They don't want, I'm not saying that there are no messianic groups in Israel who want more, but I'm talking about that kind of consensual strategic thinking in Israel. If you can annex Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank, to Israel, and more or less get rid of the Palestinians there with Greater Jerusalem, and then you can create a mini Bantustan in the rest of the West Bank, no problem with that. Gaza Strip, the long-term thinking is that eventually you could create another PA there in a very long run. In the meantime, we're using our military power. We are paying a certain price, but who is paying the price? Not the Israeli politicians in general. The poor people who live there in these development towns, most of them Arab Jews, who are getting hit by the Qassam rockets. The army doesn't mind this. It's good exercise. It's a laboratory for the military industry to show new weapons. So there are many interests there in keeping the siege, the inhuman siege and blockade of the Gaza Strip, as long as it does continue to resist and refuses to become another PA. As for the Palestinians inside Israel, they passed eventually the law they always wanted to pass, the apartheid law of the summer of 2018, the nationality law. They were afraid that the world would react because it's a proper apartheid law. It didn't, nothing happened. And just 2 days ago, the Supreme Court of Israel reaffirmed the law. So it's a deal done, kind of for them. They think, by the way, wrongly, don't misunderstand me, they think wrongly that they have the power to maintain this status quo with the dynamics I described before, namely with the need to continue to control the Palestinians in area A and B, inside Israel, in the Gaza Strip. You have to remember, hundreds of thousands of Israelis are involved in maintaining the matrix of power that sustains Israel's control over more than 6 to 7 million Palestinians. But they think this is life. This is what life means. And it's a success to maintain the project. I think they're totally wrong. I don't think there is such a thing as status quo in life. I don't think the Palestinians are going to vanish. I don't think they're going to succumb to these Israeli policies. I think they're going to continue the struggle. I think that the project is based on the wrong premises, but most of them are still convinced that they are doing the right thing.
Fantastic. We're almost at the end, so I'd like to maybe two very quick questions. There is a quote you said recently, which I would love for you to elaborate on, which is the Israeli pace of destruction is still much quicker right now than our pace of building the resistance. And I was very curious to, I mean, I agree wholeheartedly, and I wanted to see whether you had any further insights to give into why you're saying this and what you think should be done to address this.
It was born from my meetings on the ground with high school children in the Jenin refugee camp and in East Jerusalem, and talking to Palestinian students in the Islamic University in Gaza through Skype. I was there telling them about the fundamental change in public opinion in the West and how things have really shifted dramatically. And they would say, but it's not translated to anything significant in our life. And that's when you realize that none of these achievements as yet have any impact on the ground. And the reason is because, as I said, the clock of destruction or the pace of destruction is quicker than our ability to galvanize in an effective way public opinion that would force the state to change its policy. It means that you should be aware of it all the time, that never say I've done enough. I think one could conclude it by saying, I remember you sometimes meet young activists, doesn't matter where they are, who work for Palestine. And after 2 years now are a bit desperate, kind of saying to you, we've been working for 2 years and we don't see the dividends. And I say to them, I've been working for 50 years and I don't see yet the dividend. But I said, I think you're asking the wrong question. The wrong question is to ask, how much did I succeed in changing public opinion, in changing the situation on the ground? I don't think this is the right question. The right question is, how much did I do? Did I do enough? Can I do more? Not a question whether I can see the result. The result might not happen in your lifetime. Who knows? But the question you always ask yourself, did I do enough? Can I do more? Not what is the result of what I'm doing. If you are too much engaged with the question of what is the outcome of what you're doing, you might be very desperate and depressed. And secondly, you are wasting energies on something you have no power over. And that would be wrong. So I think that this is why we have to be aware of it all the time so that it enhances our efforts and our commitment.
Fantastic. We'll close with a final question from the audience. We've got Rawan asking what you think about in terms of the Israeli politics, sort of current shift to the right. Do you think this will just continue? And what can we do, or what can be done to stem the tide of this rightward shift, populist rightward shift?
Mm-hmm. First of all, I think it's going to continue. There was a bit of, thank you, Rowan, for your question. I think there was a bit of an optical mistake here because of Netanyahu's personality. The people who ousted Netanyahu did not oust him because he was a right-wing politician. In fact, the current government has as many right-wing ministers in it as Netanyahu's government had. They ousted him for personal reasons and because they genuinely believe that it was dangerous to the state of Israel. But that doesn't mean their ideology has changed. So I'm afraid we'll continue to see, it's not even a shift to the right. They've already shifted to the right. They will stay in the right for quite a while. And not much can be done in terms of hoping for a change from within. That's why the efforts have to be concentrated on change from without, pressure from without, unity from within of the Palestinians, and then maybe also change from within would come. So I think that for the time being, there's little we can do in that respect. I think people like myself, Israeli Jews, can do more inside, and we continue to do what we can. But as I said in the very beginning of our conversation, I don't think this is the focus now. The focus is not changing the Israeli mindset, and at the same time, not giving up on trying to do that. But that's not the priority. The priority is to have the practical means of easing the pressure on the Palestinians. Even if you cannot end the occupation, the siege, the discrimination, the refugehood, maybe you can make it less evil, make it a bit easier for people to go through their daily life under such heavy oppression.
Thank you. You've got a book coming out in November, and we hope to have you around that time to speak in detail about it. But for now, would you be able to tell us a bit more about it? I know the title is Our Vision for Liberation, Engaged Palestinian Leaders and Intellectuals Speak Out, and you're preparing it with Ramzi Baroud. If you could just tell us just a few words about what the book is intended to do. And
The book is a collection of 25 essays, mainly by Palestinians, but also of some people who support Palestine and who are not Palestinians, who devoted their life for Palestine, each in their own profession, field of interest, and focus in life, and passion in life. And what we ask them to do is to assess both their own role and the particular development in the field that they were interested in. For example, if they dealt with film, what did films do for the liberation? What films can still do for the liberation of Palestine? If they were involved in guerrilla struggle, then what did this do? Or as teachers in education and so on. And we're already receiving wonderful pieces in which people lace together their individual experience with a very sober assessment of their contribution. And when you put them together, you really are admiring, especially the Palestinian, resilience, resistance, steadfastness, and you can see how one can build on it, the future struggle. And I think that's, and we wanted really to educate the world at large that after years of demonizing the Palestinians, that neither in their history and nor in their present and future visions is there any menace, is there any evil, any kind of demons that are attributed to them. That actually we're talking about a very normal human community that believes in humanity, believes in human rights, believes in civil rights, and all it asks is to live normal, natural life, and this is being denied, and how they struggle against it. So we hope to contribute to a better understanding about the nature of the Palestinian struggle in the past and its way forward in the future.